Story 1, The Convenience Store Incident. There's a small convenience mart off the interstate, close to my residence. It's the sole establishment operating around the clock in my isolated countryside community. The journey takes roughly 25 minutes when I exceed speed limits, which I typically do. For those accustomed to metropolitan areas, this distance would be considered practically neighboring. My sleeping patterns are completely disrupted, so I've visited this convenience mart numerous times during late hours. I consider myself fairly average-looking and unremarkable, blending in easily, though I wouldn't be shocked if some overnight staff members recognized me by this point. This incident occurred just 7 days ago, so most elements remain vividly etched in my memory. It was past midnight and I was programming on my computer. My efficiency and concentration reached their zenith between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., so I was experiencing that productive flow state that every dedicated professional desires. The issue with late-night work sessions is that you transition from completely satisfied to desperately hungry within moments, which is precisely what motivated me to close everything down and get food around the sensible time of 2 a.m. For context, I should explain that the interstate leading to the convenience mart resembles more of a regional route than a major highway, so it's typically quite empty. The journey there was fairly unremarkable. I arrived at the convenience mart, requested a sandwich from one of the service counters, and wandered the aisles while waiting. The combination of caffeine I'm typically stimulated by and the ADHD I was diagnosed with makes it challenging for me to remain stationary, so I was essentially wandering around one of the store's corners when I observed something unusual. Facing one of the refrigerator units that lined the rear of the establishment was an individual sitting cross-legged on the floor. It was such a peculiar sight that I initially dismissed it, then quickly turned my head back to confirm I hadn't hallucinated it. And I hadn't. There was genuinely someone positioned on the floor at the aisle's end, facing the refrigerator as if studying it. I couldn't observe anything beyond the brown jacket and denim pants he wore. I needed a closer look at this individual. At his facial features at minimum. So I proceeded a few aisles over. My strategy was to round the corner swiftly, get a proper view of him, then retreat back up one of the aisles, ideally before he spotted me observing. Staring at strangers so blatantly is clearly quite impolite, so I didn't want him to notice me doing it. I attempted to be subtle about it, or at least pretend like I was examining the merchandise, but I suppose I failed at that. Because the instant I turned the corner to observe him, he snapped his head around and stared directly at me. His motion was so sudden that I actually became paralyzed for several seconds, forgetting what I was even doing there initially. And let me tell you, one glance at this individual confirmed he was anything but ordinary. Disregard the sitting on the floor and staring into the refrigerator. This guy was clearly under the influence of something, which I could determine from his unnaturally dilated eyes and the manner his lip was trembling, like it was fully shaking, almost as if he were freezing. Except it was actually somewhat warm in there and he was also wearing a coat. His posture was all contorted too, like he was tense instead of relaxed, if that makes any sense. But the most disturbing thing by far was the expression he was giving me. He wasn't grinning and he wasn't frowning either. He was gazing blankly at me with this lifeless eye contact that made it somewhat seem like he actually was deceased. The entire scene was extremely unsettling. After staring at each other for an uncomfortable duration, I finally looked away and moved up one of the aisles, anxious to collect my food and depart. It wasn't prepared yet though. I stood at the service area and waited. The nervousness was affecting me, so I positioned myself to face the store's corner where the guy had been positioned. I was partially expecting him to appear from one of the aisles, at which point I'm uncertain what I would have done, but he never did. Eventually my food was prepared. I immediately left the establishment without another consideration. I assumed that was the conclusion of it, but as I was turning to get back on the interstate, I noticed something shift in my peripheral vision. I glanced back toward the establishment and observed someone sprinting at full velocity from the store entrance to the distant end of the parking area. I was already halfway onto the interstate at that moment, but as soon as I noticed what appeared like a brown jacket, I knew it was him. As I drove past the convenience mart, I looked over at it one final time to observe that guy was now climbing into a pickup. I didn't even want to contemplate what a guy like that could possibly be rushing to accomplish at 2 a.m. I was simply relieved I had nothing to do with it. I accelerated away, just wanting to arrive home peacefully. After several minutes, the last of the fluorescent storefront illumination faded into darkness behind me, and I was driving through barren emptiness once again. I'm accustomed to being the sole vehicle on the road when it's that late at night, which is why it was so startling when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror, but it was even more startling when I realized the headlights were getting nearer, indicating they were traveling faster than me, and I wasn't exactly following the speed restriction. My initial thought was that I was about to be stopped by police, so I instinctively decelerated slightly. The headlights kept advancing and I knew what was about to occur. Police lights were about to begin flashing, and my night was about to be destroyed, but once the vehicle finally got near enough, I realized it wasn't law enforcement. It was that guy. That guy from the convenience mart. It was the identical vehicle from the parking area. I've never been more certain of anything in my existence. I slammed my foot back on the accelerator and returned to speed. The guy behind me started flashing his lights at me and honking, and I didn't know what to do. Try and outpace him or stop and simply pray that he'd keep moving. I was in a sedan and he was operating a pickup truck, so I figured I could outpace him. The faster I traveled, though, the more terrified I became. I can only characterize that sensation as genuine terror, the feeling that you're literally approaching death. By the time I'd reached 100 miles per hour, the voice in my head was screaming that I was going to perish if I kept accelerating. I swerved into the right lane, hoping he'd shoot by me, but instead he actually swerved to remain behind me. I began decelerating with the intention of stopping on the shoulder, but the instant I removed my foot from the accelerator, the pickup actually collided into me. I grabbed the wheel to stabilize the vehicle and realized I was in a life-or-death situation. The guy pursuing me was attempting to kill me. Everything was occurring so rapidly I couldn't think. I knew he was going to try ramming me again, and at that velocity, I knew I would be fortunate not to spin out. I don't know if it was the terror or my survival instincts activating, but the moment I saw him go for it, I swerved to the left and slammed on the brakes. The pickup shot past me and I watched as he swerved back and forth several times before spinning out and shooting off the interstate into the field. Despite how violently my hands were trembling and how terrified I was, I forced myself to begin driving again. I accelerated the entire way home. As soon as I got inside, I contacted the police and reported the incident, although it's not like I could precisely describe where everything had occurred. They recorded my statement anyway and I was pleased to provide it. I know for certain that Convenience Mart had surveillance cameras in their parking area, so I'm fairly confident they'll end up catching that guy. It's only been 7 days since this occurred, but I haven't heard anything yet. My vehicle isn't damaged too severely, but I still need to get it fixed. As for why in the world that guy had pursued me, your guess is as good as mine. I just hope I never encounter him again. Story 2: The Delivery Driver Ambush. This occurred in the summer of 2022. I was 25 and performing what I suppose you'd describe as an unconventional logistics position. I was transporting refurbished electronics and custom PC components for this final-mile delivery startup that was attempting to rival Amazon in peculiar rural markets. The routes were extensive and completely unpredictable. Sometimes I'd be operating for 12 hours continuously, frequently through the night, reaching these remote sections of the Southwest that most delivery corporations refuse to service. The compensation was adequate enough to make it worthwhile, and I didn't mind the extended travel since I had grown up in a road-tripping type household. This specific night, I was deep into the concluding leg of a Phoenix to Lovington route. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was navigating through this isolated stretch of Route 82, past the outskirts of Lincoln National Forest in southern New Mexico. If you've never traveled through that region at night, it's difficult to convey how isolated it feels. The road is narrow and inadequately illuminated. You might observe another vehicle every 20 or 30 minutes if you're fortunate, but here's the thing about that specific stretch. It's also the only accessible route cutting through the region for miles. The GPS alternatives would add approximately 2 hours to the journey, winding you way north through Carrizozo or something similar. So if you needed to travel from point A to point B in that section of New Mexico, you essentially have to take Route 82. Anyway, I was listening to some true crime podcast when I rounded this curve and observed a red hatchback awkwardly positioned onto the gravel shoulder with its hazards blinking. I decelerated slightly out of habit. As I got nearer, my headlights illuminated a woman standing adjacent to the vehicle. She was holding her phone elevated in the air like she was attempting to catch a signal. My initial instinct was to simply drive past. I mean, I'm not callous, but I'm also not foolish about the kinds of situations you can walk into in that section of the state at that time of night. But then I began thinking about my own girlfriend or my sister and how I would desire someone to stop if they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. Plus, I wasn't completely defenseless. I had a Glock 43 holstered just beneath my steering column. I never explicitly obtained permission from the corporation to arm myself, but given some of the regions we delivered to, it seemed like common sense to me. I decelerated and cracked the passenger window a couple inches. The woman, who didn't seem much older than me, rushed over immediately and attempted my passenger door handle, which was locked. She stated she needed a ride to the nearest gas station and claimed her vehicle had just died and she couldn't reach anyone on the phone. Her voice had this nervous quality to it, like she was either really stressed or maybe on something. I hesitated for several seconds. The situation felt slightly off, but what tipped the scale was knowing I had a firearm within reach. I figured if things got sketchy, I'd be able to handle myself, so I unlocked the door. She got in quickly and gave me this vague and slightly slurred "thank you so much" without really looking at me. The manner she slurred her words made me think she was intoxicated or maybe slightly tipsy, which made me somewhat cautious. Before driving away, I asked her some obvious questions. Had she struck something or did the engine cut out, that sort of thing, but she kept deflecting, repeatedly asking me to just drive. Nothing she stated really made sense, and I was leaning towards removing her from my vehicle the more she talked. I was about to make a decision when I glanced over at her vehicle one more time. To my horror, a man emerged from behind it like he had been concealing there the entire time. The adrenaline began to surge and I turned to face forward. There was another figure standing directly in front of the road about 50 feet ahead of us. There was something elongated in his hands, maybe a bat or a pipe. I couldn't determine exactly. He began moving toward my vehicle, and that's when my survival instinct took over. I floored it. I didn't even attempt to be subtle about it. The woman whipped around to look back and immediately began yelling. Then she reached down and began digging around in her purse for something. I had a feeling I knew what she was searching for, so before things could escalate, I yelled at her to freeze and drew my weapon. I didn't aim it at her, but instead just rested it on the steering wheel so she could observe it. Whatever she had been reaching for, she stopped immediately. To my surprise, she stopped talking too. She just stared straight ahead with this expression I couldn't interpret. Fortunately for her, we were less than 30 minutes from Artesia. After a somewhat tense half hour, I stopped at a gas station. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, both big rigs. I told her to exit. She refused initially and gave me some ridiculous reason I can't remember, but I leaned across her, yanked the passenger door open, and essentially forced her out of the vehicle. She stumbled back and fell onto the pavement, all the while yelling something incomprehensible. Someone began jogging over, probably one of the truckers, and I could already envision the accusations that were about to fly. All that guy had observed was me throwing a woman out of the vehicle, and I didn't want to handle this situation for a second longer, so I didn't. I yelled out a warning to him about her ill intentions, but that was all I was going to do. Then I peeled out of the lot before that guy could approach me and didn't look back. I drove to another gas station and began filling my tank. Then I walked over to the passenger side to inspect the seat. Buried between the seat cushions was a burner phone battery and a sealed pack of zip ties. I didn't even want to think about it. I tossed all of it in the trash and returned to the road, eager to be finished with the journey. I never reported any of it, not to the police and definitely not to my corporation. Not because I didn't think it was worth reporting, but because, legally speaking, I didn't really want to explain to a bunch of cops why I was operating around armed or why I'd physically removed someone from my vehicle. I'm not going to get into it, but you can connect the dots on that one yourself. One thing's for certain though. Being armed that night may have very well preserved my life. Story 3. The gas station encounter. This occurred about 3 years ago when my spouse and I were traveling cross-country from Utah to Georgia. Although the route we had mapped out wasn't the most direct, it passed through some locations my spouse really wanted to visit. The disadvantage of that, though, was that we'd be cutting through some pretty desolate stretches of interstate. The worst section was this portion of western Kansas along U.S. Route 400, essentially 100 miles of nothing but agricultural land. We'd been traveling for most of the day, and I had fallen asleep in the passenger seat sometime around sunset. I'm one of those individuals who can sleep anywhere in a moving vehicle, so I was unconscious for several hours. Around 10 at night, I woke up to the vehicle decelerating and realized my spouse had stopped at this tiny gas station off the side of the interstate. My spouse stated he was going to grab some snacks and fill up the tank. I figured it might have been my last opportunity for a while to use a real bathroom, so I exited and headed inside. I didn't bother bringing my phone or purse with me. I was just going to be in and out, so I didn't really see the necessity. The cashier was this older gentleman who didn't even look up when I walked in. The bathrooms were tucked down this narrow side hallway toward the rear of the establishment. As I opened the women's restroom door, I almost bumped right into this woman who was emerging from one of the stalls, which wouldn't have been that noteworthy were it not for what she appeared like. She had messy, unkempt gray hair that frankly appeared kind of disgusting and oddly sticky. She was also wearing these foam flip-flops that made this soft slapping noise when she walked. As if that wasn't bizarre enough, what stood out the most was this thick purple and green coat she was wrapped in. Let me remind you, we were in Kansas in the middle of summer and it was probably 80 degrees out. She was carrying this tied-up plastic grocery bag, and when she observed me she just stared. Not like a normal, oh excuse me kind of look, but this locked-on stare that felt oddly expectant, like she was waiting for me to say or do something specific. I didn't know what I was expected to do, so I just gave her a polite nod and attempted to step around her, but she didn't exactly rush to let me through. I figured that was the conclusion of it, that she'd leave me and I could get on with my life. But no, instead of leaving, the woman actually turned around to follow me and stepped toward the sink area. But she didn't activate the water, or look in the mirror, or do any of the normal things you do at a sink. She just stood there with her arms at her sides, like she was again waiting for me to do something. I was already feeling uneasy, so I went into the nearest stall and secured it. The second I sat down, I immediately regretted not bringing my phone or anything with me. I had no method to text my spouse if something went wrong, and I was beginning to get the feeling that something was off about this woman. I sat there for what felt like several minutes just waiting for her to leave. Eventually, I heard the soft slap of her flip-flops moving toward the door, then the sound of the bathroom door opening and slamming shut. I waited a few extra moments to ensure she was really gone, and then I realized something. I could still hear breathing. Not my own, someone else's, coming from somewhere in the bathroom. It dawned on me that she had faked leaving. She must have opened and slammed the door to make it seem like she left, but she was still in there, standing silently somewhere near the exit, probably in the corner by the door, just out of my line of sight. I didn't move. I sat in complete silence for a really long time, attempting to quiet my breathing because I was terrified at the thought of her hearing me. The whole time I kept thinking about how foolish I was for not bringing my phone. Eventually the door was opened and closed again. The breathing stopped too, which sent a wave of relief over me. I still wasn't completely convinced though, so I waited for another half-minute or so. Just as I was about to unlock the stall, I heard a huge gasp, like someone had just been holding their breath, followed by the bathroom door opening and closing again. That's when I truly began panicking. That woman had pretended to leave the bathroom twice. I had absolutely no idea what she wanted, but the fact that she was playing these games with me made it clear that whatever it wasn't good. I didn't know what to do. Part of me was sure she was gone, but if she had pretended to leave twice, it wasn't unreasonable to assume she had done it a third time. Finally, the suspense was overwhelming me and I couldn't endure it anymore. I unlocked the stall as quietly as I could and stepped out, fully expecting to observe her standing there, but the bathroom was empty. I washed my hands as quickly as possible and stepped out of the bathroom. I had no idea where the woman had gone or if she was waiting for me somewhere else in the establishment. When I returned to the main section of the establishment, there was this large man checking out at the counter. I lingered by one of the racks near the front until he finished his transaction and walked out, then I used him as cover to exit the establishment. I figured if the woman was waiting outside, at least there would be another person around. Part of me thought I was being overly paranoid, but that thought was shattered the moment I stepped outside. As soon as I exited the establishment, I observed her again. She was lingering off to the side of the front entrance of the establishment, this time clearly glaring at me. She was holding something in her hand that I couldn't quite make out. It appeared like a knife, but I wasn't certain. The manner she was holding it though, and the way she was slightly crouched like she was preparing to spring, honestly made it seem like she was about to attack me. I prepared myself to have to scream or sprint or even fight, but instead of moving towards me, the woman quickly turned and walked around the side of the building toward the rear. I sprinted to our vehicle and got in as fast as I could. My spouse looked confused and asked what had taken me so long. I told him I'd explain once we were back on the road. He didn't question me and just pulled away. As we were leaving, I looked back and observed the woman standing at the edge of the building watching our vehicle. I don't know why, but observing her made me so unsettled and uncomfortable. I told my spouse everything and he kind of got upset at me for not bringing my phone with me to contact him for help, which was fair. But that was that, and the two of us agreed to attempt and forget about the whole thing and return to enjoying ourselves. I will state that I don't use roadside restrooms anymore, which I'm not in the slightest bit upset about. Story 4, The Rest Stop Stalkers. This occurred to me in 2020. I was 24 at the time, working for a small logistics corporation. My position was to deliver automotive components between cities in the Midwest. Most of the time it was easy work, extended travels, adequate compensation, and nobody monitoring me closely, but that position is also the reason I will never stop at a highway rest area after dark again. It was mid-January, freezing cold, the kind of night where even the dashboard lights feel too bright. I was traveling along the I-80 heading east from Des Moines, on my way to deliver a package to Davenport. The travel was about 3.5 hours. I departed around 8 p.m., and by 10:30 I was in the middle of nowhere, just the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional semi blowing by in the opposite lane. Around that time I began to get really drowsy. My eyelids felt heavy and I could feel myself zoning out. I spotted one of those blue rest area 1-mile signs, and decided to stop for several minutes to stretch my legs and grab a beverage from the vending machine. The rest stop appeared completely deserted, a few dim street lights, a small brick building with restrooms and about a dozen parking spaces. Only one other vehicle was there, an old white van positioned way off at the end of the lot, lights off. I parked beneath one of the lights, secured the vehicle and went inside. The men's room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and mildew. The heater was making a weird rattling noise. I washed my face with cold water to wake up, and when I looked up into the mirror, I thought I heard the door open behind me. I turned but no one was there. I stood still for a second, just listening, but there was nothing but the hum of the heater. I figured it was just the wind and finished up quickly. When I stepped outside, I noticed something that made me pause. The white van's headlights were now on. The engine wasn't running but the lights were on. I didn't remember hearing it start. I got this negative feeling immediately. I unlocked my vehicle fast, then I climbed in and started the engine. I exited the parking space and headed toward the exit. As I did, the van's lights suddenly shut off again. I remember thinking maybe someone was sleeping in there and just accidentally activated the lights, but as I returned to the interstate I kept checking my mirrors. For about 5 minutes, nothing occurred. Then, in the distance behind me, I observed headlights, 2 small dots getting nearer. It was the van. At first I wasn't certain, but as it got nearer, I could observe it was the same boxy white van. No corporation logo, no side windows, just a dirty cargo van. It caught up to me rapidly and got right on my tail. I was already going about 75, but the van remained inches behind my bumper. Then it switched lanes, accelerated beside me and matched my velocity. The driver rolled down his window halfway. I could barely observe his face, just a shadow and maybe a baseball cap. He motioned for me to roll mine down, but I didn't. He kept gesturing and then pointed at my truck bed, like he was attempting to tell me something was wrong. At first I hesitated. Maybe one of my straps had come loose or something fell out, but then I noticed something that didn't make sense. There was nothing in the bed of the vehicle. It was completely empty. That's when I realized he wasn't attempting to warn me. I kept traveling, pretending not to notice him, but he began honking and drifting nearer to my lane. I swerved slightly to keep distance, and he accelerated ahead, cutting in front of me. For a second I thought he was going to slam on the brakes, but then, without warning, he veered onto the shoulder and came to a full stop. I flew past him, my heart pounding. I stayed in the fast lane, going nearly 90 now, just attempting to get away. Several seconds later I checked my mirror again. The van was back on the road. It pursued me for another 20 miles. Sometimes it would fade back until I couldn't observe it, then out of nowhere, it would accelerate again and appear right behind me. I decided I needed to stop somewhere public. The next sign stated there was a truck stop 5 miles ahead. I took that exit first, stopped in the lot, and parked right beneath a bright light near the diesel pumps. There were several semis lined up, and I could observe a few drivers inside through the windows of the diner next door. The van didn't stop immediately. I waited maybe 2 minutes, then it came slowly up the ramp and into the lot. I exited my vehicle and headed straight into the diner. As soon as I walked in, the bell above the door rang, and the woman behind the counter looked up. She was maybe in her 50s. I told her that a van had been pursuing me for the last half hour, and she must have observed how shaken I was because she contacted the trucker sitting at the counter. This guy stood up, huge guy, flannel shirt, gray beard. He walked outside with me, and the second we stepped out, we observed the van idling at the far end of the lot, just sitting there facing my vehicle. The trucker muttered something like, "Yeah, that isn't good," and told me to return inside. He walked straight toward the van. I didn't hear what he stated, but several seconds later, the van suddenly reversed, swung around and peeled out of the lot, heading back toward the interstate. The trucker returned, shaking his head. He stated there were 2 guys in there, both wearing hoodies, both just staring straight ahead, not saying a word. I stayed in that diner for almost an hour until I was certain they were gone. I finished the rest of my travel with my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. When I returned to Davenport, I parked beneath the hotel lights and checked my vehicle. Everything was fine, but there were 2 smudges on the tailgate, like someone had attempted to open it with dirty hands. I quit that position several months later. Now, every time I travel long distance, I fill up before dark, bring snacks, and I don't stop unless it's somewhere crowded and open 24 hours, because I know for certain if I had rolled down that window or stopped when they told me to, I wouldn't be here telling this story.